Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Of all the people, let's say in the last 2 or 3 years, that others have recommended that I interview, our guest this episode is that guy, Michael Trei, stereophile and professional turntable setter upper. What do you call that? Just you offer turntable services? Do you have a title for that?
I just call it setter upper, like he just said. Oh, doesn't make much sense, but I guess it's catchy. I don't know.
Yeah, everybody insisted that I kind of give you a call and reach out to you because
Sure.
they find you interesting. They love your writing. They love your
Okay.
work. Before we get started with any of that, though, I wanted to ask you, do you have any experience with AI-generated music?
I'm sure I've heard some, but not really.
So for the show, we did AI-generated music
Okay.
for the opening for every episode. And I was gonna just play you a sample and get let you hear how what we have here. If you're okay with that, should
Sure,
just play
yeah.
right through the phone.
Tuning in for a brand new day. Find the sound that carries away. With high fidelity we play. The occasional podcast here to stay. Listen close and hear the clear. Every note, every sound so near. The occasional podcast is all here. Bringing music to your ear.
So that's our Get Pumped track. Okay, what are your thoughts on that? Because that's kind of like a Broadway tune.
So nobody wrote that. Just an AI wrote that. Nobody sang it. Nobody played on it.
That comes from a command prompt.
That's crazy.
It's pretty wild, isn't it?
Some people can spot it right away. I couldn't, though. I don't think. Sounds like someone wrote that.
It sounds pretty real. And the weird thing is sometimes the people are flat when they sing. And I'm like, why did you waste everyone's time with flat singing when it's obviously, not a real person?
Well, maybe that makes it sound more real.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty convincing, I think, these days.
When they pitch correct and everything, then it doesn't sound real, with real voices. So maybe deliberately make the pitch a little wavy on the AI. It sounds more real.
I think maybe moving forward, we as writers should leave a couple typos in there and some bad language, and just in order to ensure it's the real thing. It's the real Michael Trei.
Yeah. Well, you see that all the time on, when people use AI voices for YouTube videos and they have a typo in the text and the voice says the word with the typo in there, like the wrong vowel or something.
Today's episode is brought to you by Focal Name America, a North American distributor. With the collaboration of two industry icons, Focal, the French brand known for high-end audio for home, car, professional, and marine, and Name Audio, the iconic British HiFi brand. Other brands distributed include Musical Fidelity, Thorens, Avid HiFi, Absolutement, BDI, and Vico Acoustic. Visit FocalNameAmerica.com for your home audio and custom installation needs. Tired of audio reviews that sound like they were written by robots? Us too. For the last 15 years, Part-Time Audiophile has been an open revolt against boring. And this year, we're doubling down. We have a brand new look and a brand new name, but the same old attitude. Find us at pt.audio for all your turntable throwdowns and amplifier face-offs. Great sound meets good times at pt.audio. How long have you been a writer for Stereophile for?
Just a little under 2 years. I wrote a few standalone reviews and now I have a monthly column. And so it's been pretty busy. I guess it was 2022, I think. But I've written for a lot of other magazines before that.
Who else have you written for? Just you want to rattle them off real quick?
So I wrote for over 20 years for Sound and Vision. I wrote for Home Theater. And then if you go way back, I audio video interiors, a lot of AV stuff. And then I also wrote for Listener magazine, which was Art Dudley's magazine back in the 90s. I wrote for that for most of its run. So that was my first writing gig, was for Listener magazine for the late Art Dudley.
In your mind, what do you think is like the biggest difference between the AV guy and the audiophile hi-fi guy?
It's a completely different type of person. I think home theater is really losing a lot of interest for a lot of people because sound bars have gotten a lot better, and it seems like people are more interested in, not having speakers all over the room. So, Sound and Vision, the magazine I wrote for, recently stopped its print edition. They're still online, but Sound and Vision came out of what had been Stereo Review and Video Magazine when they merged in 2000. Now they finally ended the print run, so it's kind of a sad day. But
yeah, I agree. I always like more is better. I always like a little more options. That's me. I like options.
Sure.
I actually started, like a lot of people in AV, I just, wanted better sound. And I got to be honest with you, I never fully got what the goal was for me with the AV thing, was to just get a really clear voice. I wanted to hear the voice of the person speaking on the TV crystal clear. And to be honest, the more I fiddled with it, the more I found it like an almost impossible endeavor to get the center channel the loudest and in the most purest kind of a thing. I was very frustrated with that over the years. And I still think in the back of my mind when I think about listening to hi-fi, how I just want a really clear voice. Because for some reason in all the setups that I tinkered with, it just never panned out the way I wanted it to,
Well, a lot of times you're at the mercy of whoever mixed the soundtrack. Obviously, if you have a multi-channel setup, you can adjust the level of the center channel individually for the mix that you're playing.
Yep.
There's two types of surround audio. There's AV for movies, and then there's surround music, which is another thing that's never really quite caught fire. It was popular for a while, but now it seems to be a lot less interest in it.
There's a little bit of like a quad revival going on too for a little bit. Companies like Rhino Records started re-releasing some of the quad track stuff, and that was all interesting. The stuff that I've heard, mixed 5.1, interesting. I think the way they can break the channels out for the individual instruments is extremely different from what you're used to, because I've mentioned this in some really early podcasts. I've heard the mix from the Grateful Dead where they took the guitars and put them behind in the surrounds to make it seem like you were on stage, because that's what the guy who mixing it wanted to kind of do. Very interesting to have the guitars behind you. I don't think people traditionally think that when they think of listening, that the guitars might be behind instead of just right there in front in stereo.
But that's a weird perspective. No one would, if you went to a live concert, you wouldn't be standing on the stage. So, that seems artificial. It helps to separate things out. But so these are new mixes you're talking about, not reissuing old quad mixes.
No, that was two different things. Correct. Yeah, this was like the 5.1 Grateful Dead mix. The quad mixes I heard at a demo, also really fun. It's a pretty good parlor trick. It's a bit hard, I think, for most people to have 4 speakers set up. There's not enough source material. It's like fun to do, but the 2-speaker, there's a simplicity, I think, to the 2-speaker setup that appeals to our 2 ears in a way I can't really put my finger on, I think, sometimes.
Well, you're eliminating a lot of phase cancellation, even more with mono if you really want to go all the way.
Yeah.
We've managed to create 2-channel systems that give you a great sense of depth in addition to just left and right imaging information. It's possible to get a very dimensional soundstage with 2-channel audio.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's a very special thing, the depth. I mean, height's cool too, but when you have a depth to the stage, the characters, the instruments, that is, to me, the special golden nugget of high fidelity, when I think it starts to turn a page to something that's a little more realism, natural. The hologram of sound that we're able to create with just 2 speakers, I think, is so unique. And usually, like I said, the turning point to high fidelity, where you just don't get that in a lot of other executions, at least in my experience.
Yeah, it's a cool effect, but I'm much more interested in the timbre of the instruments, whether the instruments sound real or not, whether the timing of the music sounds real, if it sounds like it's sluggish and dragging, or if it's driving forward, and whether the notes start and stop at the right time, and that sort of thing.
Do you feel that the thing that you look for in a really good speaker has shifted over time, or has there been like a growth pattern for you, or has it always been like that since you began your journey?
I sort of started out living in England, and in the late 70s in England, the audio press was really kind of myopic. They were very focused on certain British brands like Linn and Name. And there was this whole kind of philosophy of, what you need to buy and what kind of system you need to have. What they called Pratt was very important. It's pace, rhythm, and timing. To be honest, the Linn speakers kind of sucked at imaging, so that was never an important factor. And then I moved back to the States in 1985, went to work at Sound by Singer within a year, heard a lot of other stuff, and sort of opened my eyes to a lot of different aspects of sound that are important. So then my interest shifted quite a bit. This qualitative thing became really important to me. I want transparency. I want clarity. I want to be able to hear what the recording has on it. I'm not really so interested in how deep the bass goes or how loud it goes or how dynamic it is. Those are less important to me. I want to be able to hear what the recording sounds like and be able to separate out the elements of the recording. And after a few different systems, I eventually got into the quad electrostatic speakers, and I've been using those for 35 years now. They work really well.
I always have a special place in my heart for electrostatic speakers. There's just something, I don't know if it's a value-driven thing, but they tend to give, at least in my experience, again, a good amount of resolution for the way they cost. They give high resolution. I mean, the playback's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, well, the original quad, which is the ones I've always preferred, it's called the ESL 57 usually these days. It's the most pure of all the quad speakers. It doesn't do any tricks to try and fix some of the problems that the ESL 57 has, which are pretty severe. I mean, it has very little bass below 50. The treble beaming is very severe. So it's really a one-person speaker. You got to sit directly in a very tightly defined sweet spot. They're not particularly dynamic. They won't play particularly loud. But all these things aside, the mid-range is the most transparent and resolving you've ever heard. We can work around the bass. You can add things on to fix that. And the other qualities are less. I live in a New York City apartment. I don't want to play it really loud and have my neighbors getting mad at me. If you had a rock band performing in your apartment, you'd be running out of the door because it would be ripping your ears off. That's not how I listen. I listen fairly quietly usually. Maybe 80 dB peaks typically. I still have the quads. I have other speakers as well. Those have really worked for me for over 35 years now, I guess.
I want to give you an amen to the 80 dB. That actually is a very interesting number that I try to shoot for myself. 80 dB peaks. If you can pull that off with the speaker, that's the golden area to me. 80 dB peaks. It's not enough to annoy the neighbors, but it's definitely not quiet. If you're sitting there at 50 and 60, you can still hear it pretty good. But when you get to 80, it's lively. It's lively. It's not. But at the shows, I know I've seen you at the shows. We go well beyond that in a lot of rooms. I always ask for 80 there, and I rarely get it. I like to complain about that.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to impress everyone. As a manufacturer, distributor, I've exhibited at shows myself, so I kind of know the dilemma that you're in as an exhibitor. You've got to catch someone's attention in a couple of seconds. And, if you're playing the wrong music at the wrong time or not playing it loud enough or whatever, person can stick their head in the door, turn around and walk out, and you don't want that. I've gone to a number of live performances, and I always measure what the SPL is, with the app. And it varies quite a bit, but it's not as loud sometimes as you might think. I think I've seen a tendency for rock concerts to be not as loud as they used to be. I saw Doobie Brothers, and peaks were about 110, 111 dB. I saw Steve Winwood. It was about the same.
Did you get a chance to see that documentary on HBO called Yacht Rock?
I haven't watched that. That term just offends me.
Well, it's funny you say that because I hate to ruin the end for you, but they
Yeah.
interview one of the guys from the era, and he is also offended by that term and hangs up on the guy, and they put it in the movie. So,
Oh, okay.
it's offensive. Some of the guys do consider it offensive term that made the music. That is,
It's so
the thing.
dismissive.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
They talk about the Doobie Brothers heavily. That's why I bring it up. They talk about
Okay.
the Doobie
Yeah.
Brothers and Steely Dan. They're like the two anchors, forgive the metaphor, in that
geez.
documentary. And so I find that interesting because the 110, 120 is getting up there. It's getting pretty hot, I think. But
I saw Kraftwerk live in Asheville, North Carolina. I think it was 2016. I had the app, but the app maxes out at 130 dB, and it was just pegged the whole time.
Oh my!
Against the end stop, and it was so loud. And about 20 minutes into the show, all the subwoofers stopped working, and then about a minute later, the rest of the PA shut down. So they had to take a break for 20 minutes while they went around and reset all the circuit breakers, and they started up again. Luckily, I had hearing protection. I always carry hearing protection for these shows.
Oh, you do?
Oh yeah, you have to.
You got to protect the money makers. Am I right?
I do have tinnitus, so don't want it to get any worse.
I used to search for like the perfect earplug to like give me that real, whatever you want to call it, frequency response in my ear, and I gave up. I have not found a realistic experience with earplugs in yet, but I do think the preservation is an absolute necessity.
Well, I like the ones from Etymotic. They're pretty affordable, and they're pretty wide band. They let most of the sound there. A lot of the cheap foam earplugs. They cut all the top end out. So
yeah. Today's episode of The Occasional Podcast is sponsored by Ron Resnick's Audio Cafe. Audio Cafe is a California dealer specializing in Clarisys audio loudspeakers. As a dealer for a single brand, Audio Cafe is not limited to only a small set of recommendations like you might find at a more traditional retailer. Ron, co-owner of whatsbestforum.com and a reporter for What's Best Forum YouTube channel, takes the time to understand his clients' musical and sonic preferences, and then builds a bespoke system which maximizes emotional engagement. Visit AudioCafe.BeverlyHills.com to learn more. This episode of The Occasional Podcast is brought to you by Fernan Roby, a HiFi designer, manufacturer, and dealer in Richmond, Virginia, where they have been producing heirloom-quality audio equipment and accessories since 2010. Each Fernan Roby piece is meticulously crafted for you to enjoy your favorite music with friends and family. Follow them at Fernan Roby on all social platforms for a behind-the-scenes look at their process, or visit fernandroby.com to see their craftsmanship for yourself. Do you have any amp recommendations for the quad electrostatic? Because I know that sometimes those type of speakers can be a little more finicky. I just like to poll the crowds that come on the show about amp pairings. Do you have a favorite?
Yeah. The difficulty with the quad is, it's fairly low sensitivity, but the impedance is just crazy. Impedance peaks at about 100 hertz, and I think it's something like 32 ohms at 100 hertz. But then it just drops like a rock. And at 10 kilohertz, it's 1 ohm. So you have to have an amp that can drive that wild of a load. And for years, people recommended OTL amplifiers, output transformerless tube amps. And I had Julius Futterman built H3AAs. I had the New York Audio Labs OTL 2s, 3s. And they were fine. That's what I used for years. I had some German solid-state amps that are pretty exotic. A company called Omtec, O-M-T-E-C. But then Herb Reichert, who I think you've also interviewed, he said, try this amp. This is when he was just getting involved with Audio Note UK. And he lent me an Audio Note amp called a P2SE, which is a single-ended parallel 6L6 amplifier. And it sounded better than any of those amps on the quads. And that's the amp I still use today. I always recommend that amp to other people when, people think audio note, everything's going to be $1 zillion. That's not. It's not a cheap amp, but it's not crazy money. I have the signature version. They make a standard version, which works pretty well as well. And, they're less than 10,000, let's say. I think it's about 7,000 for the signature one.
Yeah, you got to get those prices right. People seem to get very offended if you get the...
I'm terrible at prices, yeah.
Has anybody ever approached you with a price misquote from any review or show coverage and just been like, it was a different price than what you said in the thing? The world is going to fall in. But
no, not really. We always fact check these things pretty carefully before publishing, so hopefully that doesn't happen. Sometimes what happens is
the price changes.
Right. It goes into print before it's even out on the shelves. The price has changed, and that's kind of the distributor or manufacturer's fault because they should have known of a pending price increase and should have given us a heads up. A couple years ago, I reviewed a turntable. I had it for like 3 months, and literally on the day when I submitted the copy, they announced a new version.
Wow.
Made everything I had done obsolete, and I had to start over. That doesn't endear yourself to the manufacturer when they do that, because they must have known a long time before that there was a new version coming.
Did the new one at least sound better?
Yeah, it did. I had to start from scratch. It's a lot of work.
Oh, yeah. I think that is one thing that maybe either people take for granted or simply just don't care, is that the amount of time it takes to do a thorough review is just more than the job ever pays. Let me just put it that way. You can never to give what it's worth for the time to write out a review. This cost would be insane. It takes time, it takes skill, and it really does take a level of experience. I think that's really hard to find in the day and age we live right now, where there's a lot of YouTubers, and there's nothing wrong with YouTubers. Some really, really great YouTubers. Huge fan of John Darko. He's been around. He's always been a really great one. He does a great job on his YouTube channel. But there's a lot of fly-by-night guys out there too that are kind of just doing their thing. So I always appreciate, I think, and everyone in the hobby hopefully does too, what Stereophile has done. The stands have shifted when it comes to the voice of HiFi, and we're not at the place it was. But this is one of the questions I posed to the guys that have been doing it for a long time. I want to pose it to you: is did HiFi ever have a golden age? Was it part of the pop culture ever? Has it always kind of been a smaller niche thing? But as I talked about the shifting sands of the voice of HiFi, from all accounts, it really used to be a lot less voices. Was that the golden age? Did you kind of feel like there was a heyday to HiFi at some point?
Well, from a consumer standpoint, absolutely. The 70s and the 80s was when things were really cooking. Back then, there were ads for HiFi in Playboy and in National Lampoon and on TV. It was big business. This sort of discretionary income spending. What did you have? You had cars, you had HiFi, maybe cameras. That's about it, buy a fancy watch. But there wasn't all these different things that you could spend your money on. Everybody had a HiFi at home. I think that for the big Japanese companies, it ended very abruptly around 1980, 81, when they started to kind of cheapen their approach. But before that, everyone had a HiFi at home. You go to anyone's house, they'd have some kind of sound system set up. Now nobody does. Just a few of us, And it's sad. I think the role of music in people's lives has become marginalized. People don't sit down and listen to music anymore. They might play it in their car when they're driving, or they might play it on their phone when they're cooking dinner, but no one actually sits down and listens to a record or a CD or a stream or whatever and not do anything else. They're always multitasking.
Yeah, being distracted is a kind of a weird, unseen effect of all the new social media and digital era. Just the way video has morphed into a 1 second bite, right? I don't know if you're familiar with the TikTok and all this, but the flick of the video, it's just you have to have it in 1 second or you don't have anything. It's this lack of attention.
Everyone's attention span is so short now. It's a struggle to sit down for 40 minutes to listen to an album.
Is that something that you still get to enjoy though? Do you listen to a full album on a turntable?
Absolutely, all the time, every day.
Oh, good.
It's,
Do you have a favorite story from it's either listening or setting up with someone else?
with turntables, you got sort of three elements. You have the turntable itself. Often you have a different manufacturer's tone arm, and you have a different manufacturer's cartridge, and you got to sort of make sure they're all going to work together. Yeah. So people will say, "I got this, I got this, I got this," and I tell them that isn't going to work. Like I had someone contact me just yesterday, say, "I've got this Soundsmith Mimic Star cartridge, and this turntable I want you to work on." And then I have this phono stage. It was a Vincent audio phono stage. Well, I told him, I said, that cartridge will not work with that phono stage because it's a low output moving iron cartridge. It needs a high impedance input, and your phono stage won't let you do that. So a lot of it's experience and knowing what combinations will work and what the problems are that you run into.
Do you think that the end result of listening to analog has some advantages over digital, or is it all just like what people are like, oh, it's all just your take on it?
Well, ultimately, I think a turntable is capable of conveying sound better than a digital stream. Now, a lot of records today are mastered from a digital source, so that's just the mere sort of act of playing a record. You've got to get up there, put the thing on, clean the record, clean the stylus, line up the arm over the groove, drop it down, and then go sit down and listen. You don't have a remote in your hand that will let you jump to the next track when you get slightly bored. And I think that sort of forces a level of engagement that you don't get with digital type listening. And I think that's part of its appeal is, there's a ritual to it. And ultimately, I think it does sound better. I mean, but maybe not with some recordings, mostly with older recordings. I'm not one of these people that will tell you vinyl will sound better every time. There are cases where it doesn't. Some records are very poorly mastered these days.
I agree. I think one of my surprises moving into that field of play was how you can get a bad pressing. Like in digital, if it's recorded bad, it sounds bad. It's like bad everywhere, right? If you get a record, sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. And that's just, I wasn't prepared for that because I kind of thought like, oh, well, if it's a bad recording, it's a bad pressing. Well, it's not true. Sometimes you have a great recording and a bad pressing.
It's often the recording. I mean, like I bought the Amy Winehouse albums on vinyl, and it's just not good sounding. It's got clipping and distortion, and it's just kind of sad.
Oh, that's big red flag stuff right there. Clipping and distortions. Ooh, that's a mistake. That's a fixable mistake.
Well, no, they do it deliberately. It's not a mistake. It's part of the sound that they're going for these days on a lot of things.
You think?
Absolutely. If you listen to, so one of the records that came out in 1973, Iggy Pop's Raw Power, the original mix sounded very anemic and weak and didn't have any bass. And okay. But then so Iggy said, okay, I'll remix it. Like this is like in the 90s. And Iggy remixed it. And it's all digital clipping and distortion. He said, yeah, well, I like that. Okay. I still think there's a great mix of that album. I mean, they say that there's the basic multi-track is not very good, so who knows? There's actually guys on YouTube that have remixed it and done a much better job than either of the commercially available versions.
Huh. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I will see the tactic used very intentionally in some modern recordings, but it's very, very, it's like done obviously, and it's only on certain stems, certain tracks, certain parts. Like a whole master befuddled like that is a little more rare, thank goodness. I would be, I don't know if I've heard anything fully like distorting, but sure it's out there.
Yeah, listen to Metallica's Death Magnetic. I mean, it's just so distorted sounding.
There was a bad mix, dude, for sure. I remember that album when it came on, and honestly, I don't know what he was. I'm going to go off on a tangent, and normally this isn't what we talk about, but what was he thinking with the snare drum and some of those albums in the middle there? It was just the sound went like, we have to try something different, but he wanted to make it with the snare drum sound. I think it was a bit much for me, at least.
Or Black Sabbath's 13 album that came out a few years ago. Same thing. Their albums that they made 50 years ago sound way better.
Yeah, and definitely not something we need to get into in this conversation, but the loudness wars, like,
Right.
of course, compression over the whole mix and these type of things has been long talked about. But do you have an album that you think embodies like what you like to hear, free of all these cons that we've been talking about?
Yeah, sure. There's plenty. I mean, in terms of rock music, I'm a big fan of the work that Steve Albini did. Sadly, he passed recently. So he was the guy that he hated to be called a producer. He wanted to be called a recording engineer. A band would come in and basically play live, and he would just capture it. If you listen to PJ Harvey's Rid of Me album, I mean, that's a fantastic sounding record. Talk about imaging. I mean, that's like, it's a huge room of sound, and it just sounds fantastic. So yeah, it can be done.
Any other favorites that you're listening to right now?
So I was just listening to the Talking Heads did a soundtrack for a movie called True Stories. And that's a really interesting record. It's really well recorded. It's got some amazing imaging effects. I told you I'm not that much of an imaging guy, but talk about imaging on that record. It's got a huge sound stage. And so that's an enjoyable one to listen to.
What's the process like when you go set up a turntable and it comes time to listen? What do you recommend, or how do you kind of get into the process of listening after or before or during when you go to a setup? What do you kind of like follow?
So I have a handful of records that I use for listening, to evaluate certain things. And they're the same records I've been using forever. Keep having to get new copies and they wear out. But
wow.
There are some records that I've played hundreds of times just because I know exactly how they're supposed to sound and what I'm aiming for. So one of those is a rounder, kind of folky jazz acoustic guitar record called Get Yourself a New Broom and Sweep Those Blues Away by a clarinet player called Billy Novick and a guitarist called Guy Van Duzer. And, that's a very simple recording. It's got like 4 instruments, and it's really easy to hear changes in stylus, rake, angle, and that sort of thing with that record, tracking force, that sort of thing. Another one I use, I'm a big fan in terms of older jazz recordings of the work that Roy Dunan did for contemporary records. I use one, actually it's not one he recorded, it's a different recording engineer, it's Howard Holzer, I think. It's an album by Shelly Manne, Live at the Black Hawk Volume 3. I use that one a lot. Same reasons. There's a record called Johnny Hartman. It's actually been recently reissued by Acoustic Sounds, but it's called Once in Every Life. It's I think a 1979 jazz recording with a vocalist. Been using that record since the 80s, but then I guess about 10 years ago, Chad Kasem reissued it. There's a Roy Haynes record called We Three. I use that one a lot. But it's just the same handful of records that I always take. Another great, for a rock record that I use in setups is by Willie DeVille, who was the leader of a band called Mink DeVille. And he has an album called Miracle. And that's another great sounding record. It's really what I use a lot for checking dynamics. Yeah, that's sort of, and these are the same records I've been using literally for 15 years. I get, really tired of listening to them, but I'm not listening to them for enjoyment. I'm listening to them just to assess things.
Is there a specific way that things go wrong when the alignment of the cartridge is off? Like you mentioned, tracking force. I'm very curious. Like, how do you know if the alignment is off, and that's the thing you need to attach some attention to?
Well, most things are just measurement. You're measuring things visually and using a microscope, and measuring things like tracking force very accurately. The things you got to be aware of are some arms. The tracking force can vary a lot with the height that you're measuring it at. So when you're measuring it, you got to make sure that your platform is at exactly the same height as the record. I mean, some people, it can be crazy how much that changes with some arms. And anti-skate is another one where, you sort of find out that a lot of arms, the anti-skate doesn't work very evenly, and it'll pull a lot at the start of the record and then basically drop off completely by the middle of the record and that sort of thing. So you learn a lot about different types of anti-skate devices and how effective they are and how consistent they are. But yeah, most things are just measured, and then you can fine-tune things by ear. But yeah, it's mostly measuring things. It's just geometry, really.
If someone takes like one of those record mats and just adds like a let's say a centimeter of height to the record, is that inherently a bad thing that's going to mess with a lot of those metrics?
Yeah, well, a centimeter would be a huge thick mat. I mean, that would be a stupid thick mat. Most mats are maybe 1 or 2 millimeters.
1 or 2 millimeters. Yeah. The metric system. Bah. Right. I don't even know.
That's like a third of an inch. But yeah, no, it can. And I actually took some photos showing how with a VPI Fat Boy arm, just raising it the thickness of a mat, which was their own mat, which was about 2 millimeters, was changing the tracking force with that arm by 0.2 of a gram, which is a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, I've sort of come to the conclusion that, stylus rake angle, which is the sort of angle of the cantilever against the record, or no, that's the angle of the stylus contact area against the groove, or VTA, which is the angle of the cantilever against the record. It's important, but it's less important than the tracking force with a lot of arms. And I think when people are adjusting the height of their arm and they think that they're listening to this angle changing, what they're really hearing is the tracking force changing. And that's having more of an effect on what they're hearing than the actual angle changing. People don't realize that, with a 9-inch arm, to make a 1 degree change in that angle, you got to move it about 4 millimeters, which is a lot.
What would you say is like the number one mistake that people make with turntables when they really start to get into it?
I often come to work on something that's already been set up, and the most common problem is wrong tracking force, and then not having things tightened down properly. Things like attaching the head shell wires to the back of the cartridge. Often people don't have those snug down properly, and you're getting a crappy connection from the cartridge. Just a lot of little basic things. It looks good, but it's not really tight or making a good enough connection a lot of the time. Or basically leveling the turntable. You come in and turntable's way off level, and they're wondering why things aren't measuring up right. Stylus cleaning is another one. I go to someone's house, they say it sounds all distorted and doesn't track well, and I just go and look under a microscope. Yeah, your stylus is caked in goo, I just clean the stylus and everything's fine again.
I had a friend who we were at her house, and she wasn't into it. She just liked the idea of the turntable. And she said, "Oh, I have this. Oh, can you look at my record player? I have this issue." I'm like, "Well, what's the issue?" She's like, "Well, the needle won't stay on the record." And I said, "The needle won't stay on the record? What do you mean?" And she's like, "Just look at it." So she puts like the needle on the record, and it just starts to float over the thing. And it's because there was so much hair and stuff underneath it. It had raised up the needle so it wouldn't even stay in the groove, and the tracking force was enough to pull it out of the groove.
Right. No, that can happen. People use break-in records. There's some records that have a locked groove that people put the needle in or the stylus in to break in the cartridge. But the problem is that by repeating the same groove for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, it starts to build up static at that point and can attract dust. And I've seen it where it attracts enough of a big ball of dust under the stylus that it literally slides over onto the label. That ain't good.
I guess the one question I feel like I want to ask that you probably have been asked too many times from someone who's not into turntables, like, do you have a turntable reco for beginners? Because I get asked that all the time for whatever product category people are in that aren't audiophiles, and they're just like, "Hey, what's the one that you recommend for beginners?" Because I don't like to besmirch the name of anybody really, but I will comment there are some not so great products out there when it comes to turntable entry level style.
Yeah, I think the sort of entry-level price is around $200 to get something that's really worthwhile. Companies like Fluence, U-Turn Audio, they make really nice products at very affordable prices. When you get up a little bit in price, Riga, I'm a big fan of Riga turntables. But you got to look at the whole kind of, what are they going to plug it into? Because a lot of these turntables don't have, I mean, some very entry-level turntables have a built-in phono stage, some do not. There's a company called Andover Audio that makes a box called the Spin Bass. And it's a speaker that actually sits under the turntable with a built-in phono stage and amp and speakers. And you think that's a really bad idea because the speakers are going to vibrate the turntable, but somehow they make it work, and it sounds really good.
Wow. That is not a recommendation I thought I would hear today. That's awesome. I love it.
It's funny because I reviewed it and loved it, and Fremer reviewed it and loved it. And, it seems to work. They have a new version of it. I haven't heard that, but.
And then what would be in your mind, what would be the next thing that people would want to upgrade once they have the table? Like, okay, it's pretty good. I got myself set up here. I want upgrade. Is it like a whole table? Do you maybe talk about carts, or you mentioned phono stage?
Well, it sort of depends on, where they started. Often some of these turntables will come with a very basic cartridge, like an Audio-Technica 3600. And, if that's what you have, you probably want to upgrade that. Even one of Audio-Technica's VM95 cartridges would be a big step up. It sort of depends on what they have. Obviously amp and speakers.
What? Not the speakers. Stick with the ones that go underneath the turntable. That's my recall.
There you go.
One of the most popular articles I have ever written is one that compared 3 turntable cartridges from Audio-Technica. They just said, what are the differences between these? And the search on that subject, I don't think many people did it, but it's the most popular one I've ever written. People to this day, and it was written years and years ago, still refer to it 30 times a day. And I'm just so shocked by that.
But so it's AT60 and
the VM95, EN, ML, and SL.
Oh, okay.
SH.
So it's just 3 cartridges. Okay.
EN, ML, SH. That was the one. 5 years ago. Still going strong.
Okay. That's kind of when they first came out, those particular models. That's just 3 different styli on the VM95 cartridge.
It was a turning point. Do you have any kind of experience from your time at Sound by Singer? I always hear crazy stories coming out of there. Was it like a really learning time for you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, big time. I went to college to study sound engineering and, with the intention of becoming a recording engineer. I did that briefly and decided it wasn't really for me. So then I sort of went to Sound by Singer in 1986 and asked if, thinking to get a temporary job. And they said, sure. They hired me, and that ended up lasting 8 years. Coming from this British perspective of the kind of Lynn Name approach and Riga and the brands like that. Actually, Singer sold all those brands and was that type of dealer, but they also sold a lot of American exotic gear. So I got to hear all that, and it was pretty ear-opening, I guess you would say. And, I soon changed my priorities. I bought an Audio Research preamp and eventually got the quads. And I got very interested in a British turntable brand called Roxanne, Roksan. There was a new company, and we started bringing them in at Singer. And then within a couple of years, I was working for the company. I became their North American sales director, including Canada. And then I went back to Singer. Yeah. And then, in 85, I met Herb Reichert. Actually, I met him earlier than that. I met him in 93. And then I started working with them in 95 doing Audio Note. And at that time, it was when Audio Note, there were 2 branches to Audio Note. There was the Japanese Kondo brand, and then there was the British Audio Note, which is owned by Peter Kortrup. And at that point, they were still affiliated, and we were importing and distributing both brands, along with the avant-garde horn speakers from Germany, the big kind of colorful round horns. And we imported those as well. And then that lasted for a while, and I left that company shortly before they had a split, where the Kondo brand and the British brand went their own ways.
What would you say is your big learning that you got from all that experience? If you're talking about to your 20-year-old self or whatever, and you're thinking about what you chose, your path and all that, what do you think was your big learning? Like, what would you tell that person? Dude, I can save you 20, 30 years of work experience here with this one lesson I've learned.
Being so influenced by the British hi-fi press in the late 70s, early 80s, they weren't very open-minded, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of our way or the highway, and I learned that that's not true. There were magazines that were so biased back then, British magazines. There's one called The Flat Response, which was a little kind of niche magazine. They didn't even have it on newsstands. You had to go to dealers to buy it. They would review a Koetsu and say, this is a piece of junk. It sounds worse than a $10 Audio Technica or stuff like that. Or, they just dumped on any American exotic gear like Magna Planer or Audio Research or Krell or whatever. It's just, kind of sad, really. And I think once I heard a lot of that gear, my horizons opened up a lot. I wasn't merely so focused on this certain type of approach.
Do you, and we've done an entire podcast on this, do you feel that there is a specific tonality or a sound for Brit-Fi, for British gear specifically? Do they gravitate towards a singular style?
I think there's some of that. There's what people call the BBC curve, which is where the frequency response that the BBC uses is not entirely flat. It has a little kind of a dip in the lower mid-range, or is it a bump? I think it's a bump in the lower mid-range that kind of gives it a warmth. And, you hear that because the BBC had a lot of influence on British companies, speakers like the LS35A, which was a BBC design, and some of their bigger ones. It's companies like Spender and Harbeth, and there were a bunch of others back in the 70s that were all heavily influenced by the BBC. So, I think there is a certain characteristic sound. Even in the States, there was what we called an East Coast or New England type of sound and a West Coast sound. Companies like JBL on the West Coast and companies like Advent and AR on the East Coast. And those had distinct sounds. The sort of feeling was that the West Coast speakers were louder, brasher, more dynamic, punchier, and the East Coast speakers were more polite and, refined, smoother, maybe more like the British sound, which I guess would make sense since it's New England.
Well, I've just been interested. I'm not saying anything in specific, but I've just been interested in probing the idea that there might have been some type of New York sound around the same time of Sounds by Singer, like what came out of that space that had so much power, so much voice, so much influence in the greater scene of hi-fi later that still maybe exists or created like an inroad, like, oh, we really like this thing. And the greater impact of having so many influencers coming from a single source, I think is a very interesting proposition, at least in regards to like how people think about hi-fi.
Each store in the New York area back then, they got exclusive brands that they could sell, and there was a lot of competition between the different stores. So at Singer, for speakers, we were selling Apogee, which became really hot for a while. We were selling, and one of the key brands was Snell, which is a Massachusetts speaker company. That was a fantastic speaker. I mean, the Model A, or A3, the third version, I owned 4 pairs of those over the years. For a while, I had a home theater with 3 of them across the front. Fortunately, Peter Snell died in 1985, and it's interesting that after Peter Snell passed, the company continued, with new speaker designers and new products. But Peter Kortrup, who founded Audio Note, but later on, in the UK, he became the distributor for Snell speakers in mostly Scandinavia. He wanted them to keep making the old versions, the ones that Peter Snell had designed. And for a while, they obliged him, and they kept making the old J's, K's, and E's. No, I guess it was J's, K's, E's, and the A's. They made them for a while, but then started to change them, and he felt they weren't the same, so he started to make his own. I would call them knockoffs, but he's sort of taken the designs and run with them, turn them into something else now, and they still make them today.
Do you feel there's any trend or like observation that could be gleaned from the size of a company and the idea of maybe a committee harnessing the sound for any given speaker or component as opposed to the individuals? Because it seems to me like a lot of good stuff comes out from individuals who have an idea.
I think a guiding voice or your personality is pretty important a lot of the times. You got to have a vision, and the company reflects the vision. It doesn't mean it has to be a small company. Companies like AR is Edgar Vilcher and a few individuals that were defining what they were making. And if you look at a company like Polk Audio, there were individuals there, Matthew Polk and Sandy Gross, that really defined what that company was making. Once they leave, they kind of lose their focus once those people leave the company. But yeah, I think an individual, like classic cases, Krell, which was Dan D'Agostino and Rondi D'Agostino, who sadly passed last year. Once they were gone, the company did lose a lot of focus. Now, Dan left earlier and then Rondi came back, but I think the company had lost a lot of its focus and it became less clear what their objective was after that point.
What's your outlook on the future of high end? Are you one of the doomsdayers? Do you think that we're going to see a refresh from all the head fires coming up?
I think the headphone thing has kind of peaked already. It's great. I remember going to the first HiFi event here in New York. I don't know what year it was, maybe 15 years ago, and walking into this big kind of conference room at a pretty seedy rundown hotel out in the middle of Queens. There were all these 20-somethings with desktop computers running files and big tube amps hooked up to their headphones. I couldn't believe it. I had never seen anything like this before. Still an active interest group, but for a while there, people were selling $500 headphones all day long, and it seems to have dropped off somewhat. I don't really get involved with headphones, so it's hard to say precisely what the market's doing.
I do think that if you look back 10 to 15, we saw this massive surge, right? We saw, if you just talk about how many brands are in the space, it used to be like Grado and Sennheiser and just a couple of little brands, and then boom, explosion during this time period. It'd be hard to even quantify this, but how much it could expand to, and how much it was successful in expanding to, and maybe now it's coming back down. That seems likely, but I don't have the numbers, but I get what you're saying.
I think Beats by Dre did more than anyone to kind of promote this whole scheme, even though I was never a fan of their headphones, but the marketing was genius. They got every NBA player to wear these around their neck while they were warming up, or walking onto the court, and it became a fashion statement. Suddenly everyone had to have Beats headphones, and suddenly you could sell people $300 headphones.
Yeah. And not even with the promise of quality. It's so funny
they promised quality. I'm not sure if they delivered it.
I'm just alluding that it wasn't all a quality promise. It wasn't, hey, come here, better hi-fi. The brand, the status symbol was part of the messaging in a large way,
100%.
Alongside better sound.
Yeah, 100%.
And that's a tricky thing. That's just a huge, massive pile of money you're going to have to spend to pull that off.
Noli responsible for that, or was it, Dre and Jimmy Iovine that were responsible for that marketing move? It really worked.
I did see one interview with Eminem saying that Jimmy specifically came to him and said, put the headphones in the video, put the headphones in the video, put the headphones in his next music video. And right. So he was severely irritated, but it wasn't even a money thing. It was like favors or for whatever motivation, whatever leverage he had, he was leveraging it hard, and he was able to really get in the zeitgeist for maybe less money than you might expect. I don't know. But those types of huge waves of influence are very expensive to pull off from a marketing standpoint, generally speaking. Kind of at the end here, you want to let the audience know anything that's been on your mind lately about audio or otherwise, what do you noodle over in your mind when you think about the next thing to write or the next kind of evolution that you think of and see or observe?
People keep coming up with new products that are fantastic, so I got to check them out and see if they're worthy. Write about them. There have been a couple of movements. There's a lot of, in specifically phono products, that in the last few years we've seen a real return to current mode phono preamps. We're it's a zero impedance input with a very low impedance cartridge. It's a completely different way of amplifying the signal, and it's not new. I mean, Meitner was doing it 40 years ago, but now we've seen a whole surge of new phono preamps that work that way. And then the other thing, of course, is the optical cartridges.
Oh, yeah.
The DS Audio. At this point, DS Audio is the only one making the cartridges, but now there's a bunch of new manufacturers that are making we haven't decided whether it's called an equalizer or a power supply box, but because it does both. Accompanying box that you have to use with the DS Audio cartridge, there's probably a dozen different manufacturers now that make one. And I think they sound pretty incredible. I've reviewed, I think, three different models of the cartridge, and I'm getting more of the equalizers in soon. So,
wow, that's cool.
That's a real development. And it's another thing that's not entirely new. There were optical cartridges in the 70s, but they had problems, and the problems have now all been solved by modern technology.
Do you remember? I don't know if this thing is still around, but do you remember the hoverboard record player, the one that had the maglev?
To be honest, that was a gimmick, I think. I was asked to set up two of them by different people, and one guy, it was twice, the same guy. I went out there the first time. The thing was defective. It was making a hideous noise when you tried to run it. He got that one replaced under warranty, and I came out there and the second one was defective. A separate customer had similar problems. Technically, there's a lot of problems with that thing. I mean, to be honest, I think it was a gimmick. I'm not going to mourn that one.
How stable is it? Because I don't know, when it rotates, it's just like if there's no pressure pushing back. I always thought maybe it was susceptible to wind or something.
Well, I don't think wind, but the forces of the arm on the record it could cause the platter to wobble.
Yeah.
But in addition to just sort of wobbling up and down, the problem is that there was no kind of fixed reference point for the rotation of the platter, so the spindle wasn't in a bearing. So, if you put varying drag on the stylus, it's going to pull the platter out of concentric rotation.
Wow, yeah.
So it's going to slip, maybe imperceptibly visually, but it's going to slip slightly out of being where it's supposed to be in terms of left to right or lateral location. And that will cause the pitch to go all over the place. Well,
Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the show. I appreciate all your insight. And
no problem. It's been a gas.
Gas? All right. I like that expression. The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes parttimeaudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA newsletter, and audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. The Occasional Podcast and its original associated music is monitored, mixed, and mastered on the Focal Trio 6 BE studio monitors. AI songs produced by Udio.com. If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.